Last week we laid down some very, very vital, important information on the foundation of our holiness. And this is really part 2 of the beginning of holiness, because what I want to do tonight is I want us to discuss really that our pursuit of holiness is where we begin to think about holiness and desire to be holy really comes from a desire to obey God. And let me demonstrate that by giving you 2 passages of Scripture, and I'm just going to read them real quick. Leviticus 11:44. Here we have, in the Mosaic Law of the Old Testament, we have Moses writing down the words of God. And here's what God says: consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. And you say, well, that's Old Testament stuff. That's Mosaic Law stuff. That's not stuff for us to follow. Well, until you get to 1 Peter, and 1 Peter says this. He quotes that Leviticus verse, and he says this in 1 Peter 1:15 and 16. But like the Holy One who called us, be yourselves also in your behavior holy, since it is written, be holy as I am holy. So, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, we have this decree of God, this command of God, that people that claim to follow the Lord are supposed to also then pursue holiness, because God is holy. If you say, I'm a follower of Jesus, and you're not a pursuer of holiness, something's wrong with those 2 statements. Jesus was holy. We are to be holy. So what I want to do tonight is I want to begin talking about how we, in our behavior, pursue holiness. What does this look like? How do we do this? So I want to give us tonight the macro level view, and then over the next few weeks we'll look at the micro level view, and we'll look at individual things, repentance, and we'll look at individual things. Today I want to take the macro view, the big view. And I brought my trusty whiteboard because after each point I'm going to draw something on the board to give you a visual of at least how I visualize this macro level pursuit of holiness. The first thing I want you to see is that holiness is wholeness. When we begin to think about holiness, we must think about wholeness. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 23, if you'll turn there with me. This is at the end of Paul's first letter to Thessalonica. And as he's wrapping up this letter, he makes this statement in verse 23 of chapter 5. He says, now, may the God of peace, we saw that this morning, didn't we? The God of peace, and just as a side note, did you notice that the God of peace annihilates the devil? Yeah. Anybody catch the irony in that? Here's the God of peace is going to destroy anything that's not true. I love that. And here we have God of peace as well. Now, may the God of peace himself sanctify you. That word sanctify means to be, here it's talking about in practice and holy behavior. It's talking about being made holy, becoming holy. Notice, he says sanctify you completely. And may your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. So what is God's thinking when it comes to holiness? Does He want part of us holy and then other parts of us not holy? Is it like, hey, just make that spirit holy, but what you do in the flesh won't matter? What you do with this body doesn't matter. Hey, make sure that mind is holy, but the soul part, does God break it up like that? No. The God of peace himself will sanctify you completely. May your whole spirit and soul and body be kept blameless. So the goal of our pursuit of holiness, the goal of God pushing us and working in us to make us holy, is that we will be whole. All of who we are, all of what we do, that everything will be holy. We like to segregate things into compartments. We're good about this as human beings. We like to segregate things into compartments. We like to spiritualize some of them and keep on some unspiritual. In other words, hey, going to church, spiritual. Praying before we eat, spiritual. You know that we were hanging out the other day at the restaurant. We were just shooting the breeze and talking. It's not really spiritual. You know that I was at work the other day, and man, my boss was all over me, and it was just a tough, horrible day, and I was just, maybe your job is just to file papers, or you're just on the computer all day long, and you're just thinking, how is this spiritual? The point of holiness is to remove those compartments. To get away from the idea that some things in my life are spiritual and some things in my life aren't. The truth is, as we begin to pursue holiness, we're going to be pursuing wholeness so that everything in our life becomes spiritual. Everything in our life is a pursuit to honor the Lord with it. Paul does not think that things should be compartmentalized. In 1 Corinthians 10:31, you are very familiar with this passage. It says, whether you eat or drink or whatsoever you do, do all to the glory of God. Now I want you to think about that for a minute. Why did Paul say whether you eat or drink? Why did he mention those two things? Because they're the most common things you'll do every day. Those are just common, everyday things that you do. You eat and drink. Why? To stay alive. Paul says those are supposed to be done to the glory of God. So is Paul setting aside eating and drinking as unspiritual and prayer as spiritual? No. Paul's saying eating and drinking is supposed to be spiritual. Here's another one, Colossians 3:23. Whatever you do, do it as unto the Lord. Whatever you do, wherever you go, whatever your spirit and soul and body engage in, that is supposed to be done as unto the Lord. Romans 14:23. Anything not done of faith is what? Sin. Let me repeat that to you so that can kind of hit us in the face a little bit. Anything not done of faith is sin. Wow. You see how Paul's not compartmentalizing things? He's not breaking things up and saying, here are the spiritual things and here's the not so spiritual things. And Paul's saying everything. In 1 Thessalonians, he says, completely. All of you. So the Bible teaches a wholeness of our lives, where we take all the areas of our life and we join them together in complete wholeness. Now, this is where I'm not an artist, guys, okay? So, I did practice this, by the way, though. Let me get this so everybody can see it. Okay, there's our oblong circle. There's our wholeness. And what we do is we've got these areas of our life here. We've got these things in our life. We've got our spouse. We've got our family. We've got our friends. We've got our work. We've got recreation. We got entertainment. And you see how we could fill this entire thing up, right? These are just 6 examples. We could fill the entire circle up with other things, other points that are a part of our lives. And what we like to do usually is we like to break these up. Entertainment's over here, recreation's over here, work is over here, friends is over there. And we break everything up. But what I want us to understand is that our pursuit of holiness brings all of the things in our lives together. And it joins them together. So that entertainment, friends, family, spouse, work, recreation are not compartments in our lives that we break up, but we bring them all together in wholeness. That makes sense so far? All right. Point number 2. Everything that I'm going to get from this point, I got from a book called The Things of the Earth by Joe Rigney. It is the best theological book I read all year long. I'm going to blog about my favorite fiction book, theological book, and biography that I read this year. This is the book, my favorite theological book I read all year long, Things of the Earth by Joe Rigney. And as we begin to think about this wholeness, as we begin to think about our lives and the stuff that makes up our lives, the Bible gives us two complementary views of looking at the stuff in our lives. All right? Two different ways of viewing God's relationship with the gifts that He's given us. The first is the comparative approach. All right? The comparative approach. The comparative approach takes God and puts God on the scale, and on the other side of the scale puts everything else. So if we're doing the comparative approach to our lives, we take God and we put God on the scale, and we take everything else in our lives and we put everything else on the scale, and we see which one is weightier, which one has more glory to it. You take your spouse, you take all these things, your spouse, your family, your friends, work, recreation, entertainment, anything else you can think of in your life, your home, your car, any gift that God has given you, any blessing that God has given you. You take all of those things and you put them on the scale. On the other side of the scale, you put God to see which one is weightier and more glorious in your life. And we as Christians, when we do this, when we put God on one side of the scale, everything else on the other, we should say what Isaiah says in Isaiah 40, verses 15 through 17, when he says this: "Behold, the nations are like a drop from a bucket, and are accounted as dust on the scales. Behold, He takes up the coastland like fine dust. All the nations are as nothing before Him. They are accounted by Him as less than nothing and emptiness." So what happens when we put God on one side and everything else on the other? God outweighs it all, doesn't He? In fact, the words of Isaiah says, everything else is nothing compared to God. Remember what Paul said? "I consider everything rubbish." By the word, that word rubbish, I think the King James translates it dung, I believe. It is the strongest word that Paul had to speak of human excrement. Paul's saying, when I look at everything else in my life, and then I look at God, that's how I view everything else compared to God. The comparative view. Now let me ask you a question. Is that a proper biblical view of looking at things? Yes, absolutely. But that is not, I will say this, if you just stop there, you have not reached maturity. Because if you simply stay in the comparative place where God outweighs everything else, do you know what you'll do? You will flee everything else because God's better than it. So I can't enjoy work because God's better than that. I can't really enjoy my spouse because God's better than that. I've had young men sitting in my office who are about to get married or who are married, and they say, how do I make sure that I do not love my wife more than God? I don't want to make an idol out of my wife. I don't want to, and I say this. I said, do you love God? Yeah, I love God with all my heart. Then just love your wife. See, what they were doing is they were staying in the comparative place where they were comparing their wife to God. Well, there's no comparison. God is greater than my wife. But if I just stay there, then what's going to happen is I'm going to have a tendency to think that I can't enjoy the other stuff on the side of the scale because they're not God. And that brings us to the integrative view. The integrative view. The integrative view says this: when we love God supremely, so once we have done the comparison view and we have said, yes, God is supreme over everything. Once we've done that, the integrative view says this, says, then what we are to do is we are able to integrate our joy in God into all the areas of our life. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an X right in the middle of our wholeness. X is for Christ. By the way, we're in Christmas season. When someone says Xmas, they're not removing Christ out of Christmas. This was actually a Greek shorthand for Christ. So when you hear people say, they're trying to get Christ out of Christmas, say, no, they're not. That actually stood for Christ by the Greeks. So, I mean, they might be doing that but that's not what the X means. The X is good. So we're going to put Christ in the middle here. And what we're doing is we're not going to do the comparative thing. We've already established Jesus is supreme over everything. Then once we have established Jesus is supreme over everything, then what we are to do is we are to integrate that love of Jesus, that love of God, that delight in the Lord, the joy that we have in God. We are to integrate everything else in our life around Him. You see the difference between just comparing and integrating them? Supreme love for God orients all the other areas of our lives. When we love God supremely, we are free to enjoy all the other areas of our lives through Him. Right. So in other words, you say, entertainment. How am I supposed to enjoy entertainment through Christ? How am I supposed to enjoy, how does rec and work and friends and family, how does that all, well, here's the thing. When we filter everything through our love for Jesus to that, then all of a sudden everything begins to get connected. You see that? Now everything begins to get connected. So we're not compartmentalizing rec and work and friends and entertainment and spouse and family and saying some of those will have a lot to do with Jesus and some of them won't. No, what we do is we say, no, Christ is supreme over everything, and since He is supreme over everything, I'm going to put Him dead center of my life, and everything now in my life will be enjoyed through Him. See, what happens when we don't think like this is people come up to you and they say, but wait a minute, you have a nice car. And you're not, when I see that Jesus came up to the rich young ruler, He told the rich young ruler, sell everything you have. Sell everything you have and give it to the poor. Then you can follow me. Do you know what the problem was with the rich young ruler? The rich young ruler had done the comparison game, and the things of the earth outweighed God. And so what Jesus was doing with the rich young ruler is He was saying, hang on a second. You can't come to me and want to follow me because you don't view me as supreme. So the heart of the matter is, you've got to get rid of everything you have and follow me. He was revealing to the man that when the man did the comparative, God or my stuff, his stuff outweighed. But once we establish that Jesus is supreme over everything else, you don't have to sell your nice car to love Jesus. That's right. In fact, I would say, if you have a nice car, view that car through Christ. View it through Christ. View it through Jesus. View your work, your entertainment, and your spouse, and your family, and your friends. Orient everything in your life with Christ being the center. So, you see what happens? Another thing that we do is we want to make Jesus the priority, right? And I've said this in here before. We want to make Jesus the priority. And so what we're tempted to do is we're simply tempted to make a priority list. Right? Who's number one? Who's number one, right? God. Who's number two? Yeah, your spouse, probably, right? 3, you've got your family. You've got, maybe you have family, number 2. Church, number 3. If your family... if you've got family who don't know the Lord, then some of that may even be flipped, right? Because you'll be closer to church family than you will be even to blood family. And then we start ranking them, and we just start down the list. What I'm trying to say is, when you think integratively, you do not make a priority list one down the line. What I'm saying is, we already established as Christians, Jesus is supreme. Once we establish Jesus as supreme, we get out of the mindset of priority lists or the scales, and we move to the integrative. where Jesus becomes the center of everything we do. I like how Joe Rigney says it. Because all of these areas of our lives are blessings from God, His divine excellence is present in all of these areas. Would we not all say, God has given us our spouse? God has given us our family. God has given us our friends. God has given us our work. God gives us the love for recreation and the ability to be healthy enough to do those kinds of things. He created entertainment. He created the arts. This was God's doing. I mean, the first word spoken out of a human mouth and recorded in Scripture is poetry. All these things are a blessing from God. Is your home a blessing from God? Is your car a blessing from God? Are the clothes that you're wearing right now a blessing from God? Absolutely. And since they come down, since every good and perfect gift come down from the Father of lights, since they are a gift from God, then the divine excellence of God is seen in those gifts. Once you determine He is supreme. Now, if you don't view Him as supreme, then we're going back to the rich young ruler issue, right? We're going to start with, why do you view stuff? That's idolatry. Why do you view stuff as more weighty and more glorious than God? But as Christians, we got to establish that truth and then move on to the next stage of maturity. I would say move on to the next stage of holiness, which is becoming whole. Taking all the areas of our life, bringing them together and orienting them around Christ. Now, then we ask the question, how will we know if we're doing that? That's a tough question, isn't it? How will we know if we've done this? Well, Thomas Aquinas, if you've heard of him, he outlined holiness as the expression of the three theological virtues. Anybody want to take a guess what the greatest three theological virtues that Thomas Aquinas laid out? Absolutely. There they are. Faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these being love. So, these virtues, by the way, those are found in 1 Corinthians 13:13. As we extend our love for the Lord, Christ being at the center, as we extend our love for the Lord to delighting in Him in all the areas of our lives, we will know that we're doing that when we are expressing faith, hope, and love in all these areas. So, when you've got faith, hope, love, faith, hope, love, faith, hope, love, faith. Now I'm sideways. Hope, love, faith, hope. Oh my goodness. Faith, hope, love. When all of a sudden now, you can begin saying, am I demonstrating faith, hope, and love at the workplace? See, if you're not, then you're not orienting the workplace through Christ. If you were orienting the workplace through Christ, then faith, hope, and love are going to be displayed there. That makes sense? Well, entertainment, same thing. Can I, in the entertainment that I'm partaking in, can I display faith, hope, and love? Is faith, hope, and love being expressed by the entertainment that I'm taking in? I'll give you an example. So my kids were watching Saved by the Bell. You know, remember Saved by the Bell from the 90s? Great, crazy, corny show. And so the teacher was, I can't remember exactly what was going on, Kate and Andy were watching it. And so I walked up to them, and I just kind of stood behind them, and I'm watching, what they're watching. And I said, Caden, pause that for a second. So they paused it. And I said, let me ask you a question, guys. What is this episode saying right now? What is it that Zach is trying to display or say about life in this episode? And me and my kids had this great conversation. I mean, there wasn't anything sinful about the episode. But me and my kids got to have a great conversation about what's Zach's worldview right now? How is Zach viewing the world right now? I remember the first time One of the first movies that Caden and I went to go see, I think we took Andy and I think Jess went as well, it was the Rise of the Guardians. The Christmas movie where you've got Nicholas St. North and the Easter Bunny and all of these creatures, all real, by the way.
Of course.
I'll fight you all right now. And plus I'm going to be on YouTube, so I'm just covering my bases here. And so what happened is each one of the characters, in order to become a guardian, had to find their center, like what made them them. And Jack Frost couldn't figure out what made him Jack Frost. How do I help the kids? How do I bless the kids? Santa Claus was wonder. What he brought the kids was wonder. The Easter Bunny was I think newness. Just always, kids always have this outlook on life that's so refreshing and new, and Jack couldn't find his. And then he remembered that when Jack Frost shows up and everything ices over, the kids don't have to go to school. Jack Frost brought them joy to wake up and go, we don't have to go to school. And he found his center. And we were walking out of the movie theater, and I said to my kids, I said, what was each one of their centers? And they mentioned what each of them were. And I said, well, who brings us wonder? Caden goes, well, Dad, Jesus is wonderful. So God gives us, where do we get our joy from? And all of a sudden, this entertainment became more than just entertainment. Right? Because we were filtering it through Christ. So when we begin asking ourselves, how do I know if I'm doing this? You need to ask yourself the question, is faith, hope, and love being expressed through these different areas of my life? If you say no, then you have not integrated them through Christ. You're still keeping that compartmentalized. You're still saying, that's an unspiritual part of my life. But when we become holy as God is holy, there is no such thing. When we're on the new earth, will there be any part of us that is not holy and spiritual? No. Then that is our pursuit now. That's what we're pursuing. Now, all of this, we need to ask ourselves the question, what's our motivation? Not like an actor, like, what's my motivation? What motivates you to do this? Now, last week we talked about salvation as the foundation point, right? The foundation of our pursuit of holiness is salvation. Ephesians chapter 2. How are we saved? We are saved by what? Grace through faith. It is not of works, so that no man can boast. So if you are doing any of this, thinking that any of this is going to gain you something from God, it's the wrong motivation. We do not do this trying to get something from God. Well, if I do this, then God will give me this. If I do this, then God will view me this way. If I do this, then I'm performing right, and then God will look at me and He'll be approved of me if I do this. Wrong motivation. We are not motivated by what we can gain by our performance. Because you know what we gain by our performance? Nothing. Ultimately, hell. If you want to be judged by what we get on our performance, it's hell. Paul said, my righteous works were as filthy rags. Filthy rags. And by the way, do you know what that Greek term is? They were the menstrual rags that women would clean themselves with. Hey, this ain't me, this is Paul. I mean, don't get mad at me. I get an email, Brother James. 48 to you. I always like having someone that the buck stops with above them. So what's our motivation? Gratitude. Thankfulness. How many times are we commanded in the Bible to praise and to thank the Lord and to be filled with gratitude? I get confused on where I say things. I don't know if I'm saying them upstairs, if I'm saying them down here. I don't know where I said this. But I have been, something that has been weighing so heavy on my heart lately has been that in Romans chapter 1, have I said this down here? I think I did. But in Romans chapter 1, when someone is suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, they see creation. They do not honor God as God, nor do they what? Give thanks to Him. What's amazing to me, what hit me like a ton of bricks was, one of the number one things that happens to a person who is suppressing the truth and not honoring God is that they are an ungrateful person. So I started thinking, well, my goodness, then the converse is true. If we are fully honoring God, guess what we're going to be? We're going to be the most thankful, grateful people on the planet. Why? Because we're looking at nature, we're looking at God's creation, we're looking at all these blessings. First and foremost, salvation, and we're saying to God, thank you. Now I live my life because I love you, and I want to live my life out of gratitude to you. Not what I can gain from it, but to honor you with it. Out of gratitude, out of thankfulness. Because we are so thankful for what He has done for us, we love Him and we want to glorify Him and exalt Him in every area of our life. Do you know what begins to happen? You know what will happen as you begin to do this? People on the outside, you've got these people on the outside, right? They're here with the entertainment, they're here at work, they're here, you got the friends, you got other people in the family, maybe even your spouse is lost. You got all these people that are in these in these areas of your life. They don't see all this, right? But all of a sudden they're seeing that you're doing rec differently than them. You're doing entertainment differently than them. You're loving your spouse in a way that they're not loving their spouse. You're a different kind of friend. You're different at work. What begins to happen is that the people on the outside who don't know what you've done on the inside, what they begin to see is that these areas of your life are being infiltrated by Jesus. And then they're going, what is it about you that's so radically different than me? See, if we just spiritualize some things and unspiritualize some things, then these people here who see the wreck, they don't see Jesus in the wreck. Why? Because you've compartmentalized it. Recreation is not spiritual. Well, then how are you going to be a witness for people? How are you going to make Jesus look glorious as these people watch the way you do wreck? And some people in your life only see certain areas, don't they? They only see the work side, the rec side, the entertainment side. They don't see everything. They just get one spoke of the wheel. And if you're not funneling that through Jesus, then they're not seeing Jesus in you in that. I remember when I was a teenager, around my junior year, God just really got a hold of my life. That's when He called me into ministry. Jessica and I started dating. I mean, the Lord just really kind of gathered everything together. And we went to a basketball tournament in Tennessee Temple University. And I really wanted to honor God with basketball. That was my desire, was to just to honor the Lord with this gift that He has given me. And so we're playing, and we get second place in the tournament. And a team, listen guys, this is embarrassing. We lost the championship game to a team that had 13 boys in the entire school. Every one of them was on the team, and the 13th guy was the manager. And they beat the snot out of us. And about a week later, a coach comes up to me and he hands me a letter from one of the other coaches that was at the tournament. And I opened up that letter, and it was a letter that had been sent to my coach. And it said, I didn't get a chance to meet Neil. I didn't get a chance to talk with Neil. I just watched Neil play basketball. And then he made this statement, one of the greatest compliments anybody's ever given me. He said, I could tell Neil was not a basketball player that happened to be a Christian. He was a Christian who just happened to play basketball. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that has stuck with me my entire life. Because I'm thinking, I'm a Christian who works at this job. I don't just happen to be a Christian that works at this job. I'm a Christian who happens to work at this job. And when we begin orienting our lives like that, these people that may only see these certain areas will begin to see Christ in those areas. And that is what the pursuit of wholeness in our holiness is all about.